Hello and welcome back to the StudyTube channel. My name is Imogen White, I'm 19 years old and I'm currently on a gap year. Today we're going to be talking all about displacement. And I'm not talking displacement in physics, all of that time, speed, distance, no, none of that. I'm talking about displacement in a geographical context. And your mind might instantly be springing to the idea of internally displaced people or refugees. But again, that's not what I'm talking about today. Instead, we're going to be talking today about how displacement links these two images together. You might recognise one of these images as the Grenfell Tower disaster from 3 years ago in the UK. So we're going to start off with the other image. In order to understand the significance of this image, we first have to think about something called apartheid. Apartheid in South Africa was one of the most infamous systems of institutionalised discrimination and racism in the world. And the impact within Cape Town itself, within South Africa, was felt most profoundly by an area within the city called District 6. District 6 was home to over 60,000 people who were forcibly displaced because of their race. Before the forced displacement, District 6 was one of the most multiracial residential areas in the whole of Cape Town. It was known as a cosmopolitan heart where all races lived and worked alongside each other. So perhaps this goes some way in explaining why this was such a threatening prospect for the apartheid regime, which believed in the idea of white superiority. Under a piece of legislation called the Grouped Areas Act of 1950, this area was deemed a whites-only area. However, nothing was done about this until 1968, when the forced removal of people of different races started within the area. In the following 15 years, when displacement continued to take place, over 10% of the city's population at the time were actually displaced, and they were moved out to areas called the Cape Flats, which are miles away from Cape Town city centre itself. After the forced removal of all of the people, the bulldozers then came in and levelled out the area, and that's what you can see in the image which I showed earlier in the video. The Cape Flats townships are areas which are remote and far away from the city. They range in distance from 12.4 kilometres from the city centre all the way out to 30 kilometres from the city centre. This is so significant for a group of people who were used to living literally a stone's throw from the central business district, the port of Cape Town and Table Mountain, to now be so far away from all of the amenities and things that they needed to sustain their way of life. And you might be thinking, but Imogen, apartheid ended in 1994. Why on earth are we looking at this from a geographical standpoint today and not a historical one? Well, apartheid may have been abolished in law in 1994, but the harsh reality of the apartheid regime still lives on for many people in their daily lives. The first attempt at essentially giving this land back to the rightful owners came in 1994, when the Restitution of Land Rights Act 22 came into force. This sought to give land back to the rightful owners who had lost their land because of racially discriminatory practices. However, a man called Basil Davison actually won his claim that this land should be kept for the Cape Town Community Land Trust, and instead they should be able to do it up. And you might be thinking, Imogen, how on earth did he get away with managing to get this land back? Well, he said that by removing the land forcibly from the owners now, that the government would be just as bad as the government who had originally removed the land from the ex-residents. He also argued that it would be traumatising for the old residents of this area to move back. And surprisingly, he won this case in court, and this kind of sets the tone for what happened to this group of people after the apartheid regime had ended. The land was then earmarked for the 2004 Olympic bid because it's in a prime position. It's barren wasteland in the middle of a thriving city. However, the Olympic bid was unsuccessful, but in 2005, the land was actually used to build a new university. In late 2007, this was home to 3,500 mostly white, middle income or international students of the university. This is so ironic because this land used to be the most multiracial, cosmopolitan heart of the city, and now it is home to just mainly white and international students. And this is the point of the video where I want to introduce the term spatial apartheid to you. Spatial apartheid is the idea that minorities are segregated out to remote areas of a city where they're unable to access key provisions. There is a key physical barrier between the Cape Flats, which is where the old District 6 residents are now located, and Cape Town city centre itself, and that is the distance. And the reasoning behind this is clear. The further you live away from the central business district, the less easy it is to access jobs, the more expensive it is to access jobs and the provisions and the amenities that are there, and therefore the less likely people are to come into those areas. On these maps, which I'm going to put on screen now, you'll be able to see where the vast majority of people live in Cape Town and where the majority of employment is. And you can see there's a massive mismatch between this, where people don't live where the employment is. In an interview with one of the people who lives in Cape Flats, a researcher found out that this woman had to leave home at 5 a.m. in order to be able to access employment in the city, and she didn't get home until midnight. And given the high crime rates, which I'll talk about later in the video, in these areas, that is extremely dangerous. However, this is not a lone situation. Many people face long commutes into the city centre, and the impact of this can be seen where in the largest township in Cape Flats, 51% of people are unemployed, which is one of the highest unemployment rates in Cape Town itself. However, I don't want to tell this as a one-sided story, and Cape Town does have an anti-apartheid plan, which involves putting in more bus routes out to the townships and building train stations in the townships so that people are able to access amenities. But this all came in 2014, when the city won the title of World Design Capital of the Year. 2014. Apartheid ended in 1994. It took 20 years for them to find an anti-apartheid plan and put it into place. With unemployment and poverty, which are exacerbated by this idea of displacement, comes crime. It's inevitable. Cape Town is commonly entitled the murder capital of the world. 7 of the top 10 murder areas in Cape Town are located in the Western Cape, and the Western Cape is where all the townships are located. Another factor that has been suggested as to why crime rates are so high amongst displaced populations is the fact that they lost their territory at one point, so they feel like this could happen again, and that leads to an idea that their territory needs to be defended, hence leading to high gang crime rates, which is what we're seeing in the townships in South Africa. Additionally, during apartheid, the laws were worded in a way where white people were seen as supreme and minorities were seen as an underclass. And that leads to people feeling like they've been abandoned by the law and having a strong mistrust in the idea of the law, hence the increased crime rates, because people feel like they have to defend themselves and the state won't stand up for them. The obvious answer here would be to move these people back to where they resided before, to the District 6 area in Cape Town. But this glosses over the more complex social structures and ideas of community and a sense of belonging, which clearly these people have now found in their townships, having been left there for 30 years. Instead, many ex-residents would prefer compensation and aid from the state in order to improve their quality of life in the townships, as opposed to being moved back into the city centre. Although legally apartheid might have ended in 1994, it's clear that the impact of apartheid still lives on in the daily lives of so many District 6 residents. Their daily lives are still hampered by a discriminatory system that existed over 30 years ago. But you might be wondering how this links to the Grenfell Tower disaster, which I showed a picture of at the start of this video. Apartheid isn't in existence in the UK, and it never has been. A year after the devastating incident, 129 families were still yet to be rehoused. That's over half of the residents of Grenfell Tower. One of the reasons it took so long to rehouse the Grenfell Tower residents was because a lot of the offers of accommodation were outside of the borough. And this meant, once again, people had no support network, people were away from their community, and they often had to travel for a much longer time to get to school or work. This is clearly not on the same scale as the South African apartheid regime, but the idea of spatial apartheid existed both in South Africa during apartheid and still to this day, and also we can see hints of it in the UK. This is just one example of how racism and discrimination still exists in our society in a more subtle way that often isn't as noticeable. In some ways, this is more dangerous because it often goes unseen in society. It's so important to call out systems that are fundamentally unjust, especially in light of recent events. So that is all for this video. I hope that you found it a useful and interesting insight into displacement, and thank you so much for watching.